until the violence of God's sense of isolation sent the heavens into a spasm of procreating words that then became matter. The violence of God's sense of isolation. Another lover, shortly after I quit drinking, told me that my eyes were dead. Maybe they were, but her saying it pierced that wall again, and at the time I still wasn't ready for it to be disturbed. She was German, and so I forgave her her bluntness. Your ears taste like poison, she'd murmur as we'd kiss. This was just days before the Berlin Wall came down, and when it did, she flew home. A few months later, I showed up at her door in Kreuzberg, something we'd talked about since our teary goodbye. You're coming out of me now, she'd whispered at the airport, pulling my hand back to her crotch. But by then, she was living with someone else. So I'm moving through the book, going from the beginning to the end, but that shouldn't matter for this reading because that's sort of the way the book's written also. So, Mexico, the war. I have a packet of photographs from when my grandparents were first married, before they had children, or maybe they'd simply left the kids at home. The photographs are of a road trip to Mexico, clearly from a time before everything fell apart. In each of the photographs, they're smiling. Maybe it was just after my grandfather got back from the war, or else it was just before he shipped out. It could have been in the 30s. They had money during the Depression. They could have afforded a road trip. These few photographs reveal more about their early life together than anything either one of them ever told me. In one blurry photograph, my grandfather is flat on his back on a hotel bed, a bottle of what I imagine to be tequila rising straight up from his mouth to the ceiling, as if a flower is growing from his face, as if he is going to finally fill himself completely. I imagine my grandmother took this photograph, and I imagine her laughing gleefully as she did, having just taken a pull herself. If you have questions in the middle, you can just yell them out also, or comments, if you're so moved. The tricky part. I call Inez 2 days after I meet her. I invite her to a play in New York that a friend had written and was starring in, a one-man show called The Tricky Part. Later that night, back at her place, we talk about whether or not we ever thought about having children. I say what I always say. I've always imagined that one day I'd have a child, that I'd be a father, but it's hard to see when or to imagine what that day will look like. We kiss a little, but I tell her my love life is a little complicated at that moment, that it is maybe not the best time to jump into something. We kiss a little more. We weren't asking each other if we could imagine having children with each other, but we weren't not asking that either. For years, I told myself that I could live anywhere for a year or two. I told myself I could be happy or unhappy anywhere. When I'd go to a new city, I'd try to imagine myself living there, and I always could. Some part of me did this with women as well. Some part of me imagined a new woman as a city I could stay in for a while, then visit from time to time. I'd know my way around. I wouldn't need a map, but I wouldn't really live there either. But a child wasn't like a city or even a woman. I couldn't simply visit now and then. You have a comment? Yes?
You're saying it was hard to describe the book, but it seems to me, I've been describing it to everybody as a book about...
I'll repeat the question for you. I'll try to condense it.
It's a book about waking up in a country that sanctions torture. That seems simple, but that would be an
So Stephen Eliot, the great author Stephen Eliot, is here, and he says that says it's a book about waking up in a country that sanctions torture. Thank you for that. I think that is one part of it, yeah. But everybody woke up in that country, so and a lot of people wrote different books. Some people didn't wake up. Yeah. I'll think about that. Thank you. This is for Stephen, this chapter. This chapter is about Stephen. You must have known. It's called Mistress Yin. A friend, I don't say who the friend is, but the friend is Stephen. We didn't rehearse this either. A friend is in town for a few days from San Francisco. I ask him if he wants to go with me to a play, a retelling of Ulysses called Dead City. It's in a theater called Three-Legged Dog, down near the hole that was the World Trade Center. We meet up beside Ground Zero, then wander for a while, killing time before the show, catching up. As we turn a corner onto another ordinary-looking street, he stops, excited. "Wait," he says, pointing down the block. "I've been in this neighborhood before. Mistress Yin's is right there. She's got the best dungeon in town." A few days later, I attend an event he's organized, a reading in Midtown to raise money to support Democratic candidates in the upcoming elections, focusing on close races in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. As I walk in, my friend is talking to a woman near the bar, and he introduces her to me as Yin. As she takes my hand, my friend remembers. "Yin's the one I was telling you about," he shouts over the din. "The one with the dungeon." "Nice to meet you," I say, still holding her hand. Clear-eyed, modestly dressed, beautiful, remarkably ordinary looking, I think, though what did I expect? "I'd like to see your dungeon sometime," I tell her, unsure what I mean by it. "Sure," she says, looking directly at me. "You can come by any time." A few minutes later, I overhear Yin say the word torture. "I'm writing about torture," I say, jumping in, interrupting. "Not that kind of torture," Yin says, and turns away. I never read that one before. But that was a fun night.
Did you go?
Did I go?
Yeah.
We'll talk after. I was actually there with the woman I refer to as Inez, who is the mother of my child, and she was right behind me, and she said, "We'll both go." I said, "I'd like to see it sometime." She said, "Yes, we'd both like to see it." So I'll just leave it at that. Lexington, Kentucky. When I see my father, this is part of the book documents. It picks up where I left off with my father, or where the last book left off with my father. I haven't really left off with my father for a while, but with him transitioning out of his one living situation into another, which was a couple years ago. When I see my father, those last few months, desperate to keep him from homelessness again, I was unsure if he knew who I was. From moment to moment, it seemed, I'd fade in and out of focus. When I tried to explain the urgency of his imminent eviction, he'd interrupt me. "Dry balls," he'd yell. "Will you let me speak?" Dry balls. This was new. This was a twist. It had its desired effect, at least the first dozen times he used it, in that I'd stand before him completely unnerved. I didn't, after all, have any children at this point. "Will you let me speak?" And then he'd launch into one of the handful of stories that I've heard 100 times before, sometimes the one about his time in federal prison. They left me alone in a dark room for days on end, shackled to the floor, and when they moved me, which they did constantly and for no reason, they shackled me even more, penis included. I didn't want to imagine how one shackles a penis, let alone my father's, which I didn't want to imagine at all. Over the years of trying to keep my father inside, after I'd ransack his apartment for a couple hours, I'd meet him and Inez in the park or at a restaurant. Then we'd walk him back to his apartment to see if he'd notice what was no longer there. He'd look around his room furiously for a moment or two, then he'd let it go, as if some part of him knew we were just trying to help. As we prepared to leave, my father would turn to Inez, who he took to calling Buttercup, gesturing toward her. "Are you leaving the woman?" he'd ask hopefully. "Are you leaving Buttercup with me?" I'll leave it at that. There's more to that chapter which may make it clearer to you, but I think it's better to leave you like that.